It was late autumn in 2016, and the rain hadn't stopped for days. My fiancé, Matt, worked as a sheriff's deputy in a small rural county in Washington state. He was used to long night shifts, patrolling the quiet roads and keeping an eye on the backwoods that stretched for miles. I was 27 at the time, working a remote IT job, which meant I could spend most nights at home. When Matt took this job, we had rented a small cabin in the woods, about a 20-minute drive from town. It was tucked away at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by towering evergreens. It was cozy enough but felt isolated, especially when Matt was on duty. That particular night, the rain hammered against the roof and the wind howled through the trees. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching the rain blur the glass windows. Our dog, Rusty, a German Shepherd mix, lay at my feet, occasionally lifting his head when the wind made a sharp whistle. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m., and I was trying to decide whether to stay up for Matt or head to bed. He wasn't due home until around 4 a.m., but something about the night felt off. The rain was heavier than usual, and the power had flickered twice already. I wasn't scared of storms. I had grown up in the Pacific Northwest where they were common, but tonight felt different. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, and during heavy rain, the gravel road leading to it could get muddy and hard to navigate. Matt had warned me earlier that some nearby roads were already flooded. I tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling lingered. Just as I decided to head to bed, Rusty's ears perked up. He let out a low growl, the kind he only made when something wasn't right. I froze, my eyes darting to the front door. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow over the rain-soaked steps, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Still, Rusty's growling intensified, and he stood up, his tail stiff, staring at the door. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but the growl in Rusty's throat said otherwise. He rarely reacted this way to animals outside. I got up and peeked out the window. The rain distorted my view, but there didn't seem to be anyone or anything out there. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I checked that the front door was locked and then went around the cabin, double-checking the windows and the back door. Everything was secure. Rusty followed me, his growls softer now but still present. I tried to calm him down, scratching behind his ears, but he stayed on edge, his gaze fixed on the door. I decided to leave a couple of lights on and went back to the couch, pulling the blanket tightly around me. I kept glancing at the clock, feeling the minutes drag by. Midnight came and went, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Rusty eventually lay down again, though his ears stayed alert. Around 12:30 a.m., the power went out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the relentless rain and the occasional creak of the wind against the walls. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to navigate to the kitchen, where we kept a couple of lanterns. As I lit one, Rusty started growling again, louder this time. He was staring at the back door. My heart pounded as I followed his gaze. The back door had a small window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across it. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but it was enough to make me freeze. I told myself it could have been the wind blowing a tree branch, but deep down, I didn't believe that. I grabbed Matt's flashlight from the counter and shone it toward the back door. Nothing. The yard beyond was pitch black, the trees swaying violently in the storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Rusty was now pacing, his growls turning into short barks. I decided to call Matt. He didn't answer right away, which wasn't unusual during his shift. I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady, telling him that Rusty was acting strange and that I thought I saw something outside. As soon as I hung up, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the front door. My blood ran cold. No one should be out here, especially in this weather, and definitely not at this time of night. Rusty went berserk, barking and growling, his fur standing on end. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, louder this time. I moved to the window beside the door, carefully peeking out. The porch light was still on, and I could see the empty steps. No one was there. My stomach churned as I backed away from the door. It didn't make sense. Someone had knocked twice. Rusty wouldn't stop barking. His gaze locked on the door. Then, as suddenly as it started, the barking stopped. He stood still, his head tilted, listening. The cabin felt eerily quiet except for the rain. I realized I was holding my breath. And then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They were faint but clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. Rusty started growling again, moving toward the back door. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. I debated calling Matt again, but knew he might not answer. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't imagining this. I grabbed the lantern and flashlight, then went to the kitchen to get the knife we kept in the drawer. Rusty stayed close, his eyes darting between the front and back doors. I stood in the center of the living room, trying to calm my breathing. The footsteps started again, this time faster, moving toward the side of the cabin where the bedroom was. My heart raced as I realized the bedroom window didn't have curtains. It was wide open to anyone outside. I rushed to the bedroom, Rusty right behind me, and shone the flashlight on the window. Nothing, just the rain streaking down the glass. But as I turned away, I heard a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the wall outside. I froze, clutching the knife tightly. The sound didn't come again, but I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Rusty barked once, sharply, and then growled. His body pressed against my leg as if trying to protect me. The next few hours were a blur of fear and waiting. The footsteps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, until I finally heard Matt's car pull up just before dawn. When he came inside, drenched from the rain, I told him everything. He checked around the cabin but didn't find anything out of place. Still, he didn't dismiss my fears. The next day, we found muddy footprints leading around the cabin, stopping at the front door and each window. Whoever it was had been out there, watching, waiting. We moved out of that cabin 2 weeks later. I never found out who was out there that night, but sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can still hear those footsteps circling the house. I've always been close to my cousin, Dan. He was the kind of person who stood out in the family, not just because he was brilliant, but because he was always chasing some new, strange idea. When he got his doctorate in entomology, none of us were surprised. Bugs were his thing, and he had this uncanny ability to make even the most repulsive insect seem fascinating. But his latest project, that's where everything went sideways. Dan had been working with a small team of researchers, studying the medicinal properties of insects. They'd secured funding to investigate species that thrived in remote areas, far from human interference. When he called me up last summer, he sounded more excited than usual. He told me they'd rented a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. It was an isolated area where rare insects were known to exist. "I could use an extra pair of hands," he said. "We're short-staffed, and I know you're good with outdoor stuff." I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending weeks in the middle of nowhere, but Dan was family. Plus, he offered to pay me, so I figured why not? I drove out there in early July, navigating dirt roads that seemed to go on forever. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Rugged, wooden, and surrounded by dense forest. Dan and his team, 3 other scientists, had been there for a week already. They'd set up all kinds of equipment inside and outside the cabin. microscopes, specimen jars, even a small lab station in the living room. The first few days were uneventful. My job was mostly to help collect samples. We'd hike through the woods, set traps, and bring back whatever we found. Dan was particularly interested in some species of beetles that produced a chemical with potential antibiotic properties. The work was tedious but not hard. I got used to the routine. Early mornings, long hikes, and hours of cataloging insects under Dan's watchful eye. At night, the team would analyze data while I tried to keep myself entertained with books and podcasts. But then strange things started happening. On the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like something was scraping against the outside walls of the cabin. I assumed it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a bear. The forest was alive with wildlife, so it didn't seem unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came over me as I lay there listening. The next morning, I mentioned it to Dan, but he brushed it off. "Probably a porcupine," he said, barely looking up from his notes. Later that day, we found one of the traps destroyed. It wasn't just knocked over, it was smashed, like something heavy had stomped on it. Dan muttered something about larger predators in the area and moved on. That night, the scratching came back, louder this time. It sounded deliberate, almost rhythmic, like whatever was outside knew we were inside. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my flashlight, but I didn't have the courage to look out the window. The following morning, things got weirder. Two of the team members, Laura and Mike, discovered that several of their insect samples were missing. The jars were still there, but the lids had been unscrewed and the specimens were gone. Dan was furious, accusing them of being careless, but they swore they hadn't touched the jars. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Everyone was on edge. The scratching sounds came almost every night now, and more traps were being destroyed. One morning, we found a set of deep gouges in the wood near the front door. They were too high up to be from an animal, and none of us could explain how they got there. A few days later, Laura decided to leave. She claimed she wasn't feeling well, but we all knew she was scared. The rest of us tried to keep going, but the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. That evening, I was out in the woods with Dan, checking traps, when I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a clearing, not far from the cabin, where the ground was littered with dead insects. Thousands of them, all different species, scattered across the dirt like they'd been dumped there. Some were crushed, others looked intact, but the sheer number of them was unsettling. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dan didn't answer right away. He knelt down, examining the insects with a mix of curiosity and dread. "I don't know," he finally said, "but this isn't natural." We gathered a few samples and hurried back to the cabin. Dan spent hours analyzing them while the rest of us tried to make sense of what we'd seen. That night, the scratching turned into pounding. It started on the back wall, then moved around to the sides. It sounded like fists or something larger, slamming against the wood. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate with each impact. Nobody slept. By morning, Dan made the call to pack up and leave. We couldn't explain what was happening, but it was clear we weren't safe. As we loaded up the van, we discovered fresh scratches on the vehicle. Long, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. We left in silence, driving down the narrow dirt road as fast as we could. I didn't relax until we were back in town, surrounded by people and streetlights. In the weeks that followed, Dan tried to make sense of everything. He analyzed the insect samples, but they didn't reveal anything unusual. The dead insects in the clearing remained a mystery, as did the sounds, the destroyed traps, and the scratches on the cabin. Dan's team eventually abandoned the project. The experience had shaken them too much. As for me, I haven't been back to the woods since. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about it. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't something we could study or understand. It was something else, something that didn't want us there. And I hope I never have to find out what it was. After my grandfather passed, my grandmother withdrew into herself. They had been together for over 50 years, and losing him seemed to take away more than just her smile. It stole her purpose. She stopped gardening, stopped baking, and eventually stopped leaving the house altogether. I had always admired her strength, but now she was just a shadow of herself. It was late winter when she decided to move to the old family cabin in northern Michigan. I was against it, but she wouldn't hear me out. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by miles of dense woods, and a single gravel road that barely remained passable during the colder months. The idea of her being alone out there terrified me, but she was insistent. She said she needed to be somewhere that reminded her of Grandpa, a place they had built together, brick by brick, decades ago. Reluctantly, I agreed to help her move. The drive up was uneventful, but the cabin was colder and more lifeless than I had remembered. It had been years since anyone stayed there, and the neglect was clear. The porch was sagging, the windows were fogged over with grime, and inside, a thick layer of dust coated every surface. Still, my grandmother seemed at peace the moment she stepped through the door. Her eyes softened as she ran her fingers along the wooden furniture my grandfather had carved himself. For a few weeks, I stayed with her, making sure the place was livable. I fixed the leaking roof, chopped firewood, and reconnected the water pipes. She hardly spoke, spending most of her time sitting in Grandpa's old chair by the fireplace, staring at the flames. I chalked it up to grief, but something about her silence unnerved me. By late February, she insisted I leave. "I'll be fine," she had written in a note. She refused to talk much, even to me. "This is where I need to be." I argued, but her determination wore me down. For the next year, I visited monthly, bringing supplies and checking in. Each time, she seemed thinner, quieter, more distant. The cabin itself grew darker too. The lights would flicker despite my rewiring work. Doors creaked open and closed on their own, though there was no draft. One visit, I noticed the mirrors were all covered with thick cloths. When I asked her why, she only shook her head and went back to her chair. By the time autumn rolled around again, her health had taken a severe turn. She was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out, and her movements sluggish. The once cozy cabin now felt suffocating. The air thick and heavy like something unseen was pressing down on everything. In late December, I decided to move in with her for a while. She didn't protest this time. The snow had made the gravel road almost impassable, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. Nights were the worst. The wind howled through the trees, and the old cabin groaned and creaked like it was alive. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and hear faint sounds, like whispers or footsteps just beyond the walls. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But one night, while stoking the fire, I found deep scratches in the wooden floor near the hearth. They looked like claw marks, but they were too big to be from any animal I knew. I showed them to my grandmother, but she only stared at them blankly before turning away. One morning, I woke up to find her gone. Her bed was cold, and the door was wide open, letting in the icy wind. Panicked, I grabbed my coat and flashlight and headed into the woods. The snow was deep, but I found her tracks quickly. They led away from the cabin, weaving through the dense trees. I followed them for what felt like hours until I came to a small clearing. She was there, sitting on a fallen log, her frail body hunched over. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and she was staring straight ahead, unblinking. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, She flinched as if I had burned her. I managed to get her back to the cabin, but something had changed. She wouldn't eat or drink, and she refused to speak. She spent her days staring out the window, her hands trembling constantly. It was the dead of night when I woke to the sound of her voice. For the first time in months, she was speaking. At first, I thought she was talking to me, but when I opened my door, I saw her sitting in the living room, facing the fireplace. She was whispering to someone, or something that wasn't there. Her tone was soft but urgent, like she was pleading. I stayed frozen in place, watching her from the shadows. After a while, she stopped, her head drooping as if exhausted. Then, without warning, she turned and looked directly at me. Her eyes didn't look like hers anymore. They were wide, bloodshot, and filled with something I couldn't name. The next morning, she was gone again. This time, I couldn't find her. I searched for hours, trudging through the snow until my legs gave out. When I returned to the cabin, I found her note on the table. It was scrawled hastily, the ink smudged in places. "I can't stay here anymore. Neither should you. He's waiting for you two now." I didn't understand what she meant, but I didn't stick around to find out. I packed what little I could and left that same day, leaving the cabin behind. To this day, I don't know what happened to her. The police never found her, and the cabin has since fallen into complete disrepair. But sometimes, late at night, I think about her words, and in the quiet, I swear I can still hear her whispering. It was late autumn, and the air had turned crisp. My dad had invited his old friend, Mike, and his son, Alex, to join us for a weekend at a remote cabin deep in the forests of Montana. I was 15 at the time, and my dad thought it would be a good idea for me to tag along and bring Sarah, my golden retriever, to keep me company. I didn't mind. Sarah loved being outside, and I figured Alex and I could at least tolerate each other for a couple of days. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town, a small, weathered wooden structure perched on a hill that overlooked a dense valley. My dad had rented it from a coworker who assured him it was the perfect spot for a getaway. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I was used to family trips like these, quiet, peaceful, disconnected from the rest of the world. We arrived on a Friday evening just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The drive up was slow, the narrow dirt road winding through thick trees that seemed to close in the deeper we went. By the time we reached the cabin, the forest was cloaked in shadows. The place was smaller than I'd imagined. It had one main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. A narrow staircase led to a loft that had a couple of mattresses. Alex and I would sleep up there while my dad and Mike took the rooms below. As soon as we unloaded the truck, Sarah darted off into the woods, her nose to the ground. I called after her, but she was already gone. My dad waved it off, saying she'd come back when she was hungry. We settled in quickly, unpacking our gear and starting a fire in the stone fireplace. Mike had brought steaks, and after dinner, the adults sat outside on the porch with beers, leaving Alex and me to explore the loft. It smelled of dust and old wood, and the single window overlooked the darkened valley below. Couldn't sleep that night. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the occasional creak of the cabin made me restless. Sarah hadn't returned yet, which was unusual for her. She was usually never far from me. I figured she must have found something interesting to chase and would be back by morning. The next day, we decided to hike the trail that started behind the cabin and wound through the woods. It was supposed to lead to a small lake about 2 miles away. I kept my eyes out for Sarah, calling her name every now and then, but there was no sign of her. The trail was overgrown in some spots, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like no one had been there for years. The forest was eerily quiet. the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive silence. Even Alex, who had been joking about how creepy the place was, stopped talking. When we reached the lake, it was clear something was off. The water was murky, and a thin layer of fog clung to the surface despite the sun being out. We sat on the shore for a while, skipping rocks and eating snacks. My dad and Mike seemed relaxed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. On the way back, Sarah finally appeared. She came bounding out of the trees, her golden coat matted with mud and her eyes wide. She barked once, sharp and loud, before circling around me, her body tense. I tried to calm her down, but she kept glancing back into the trees like something had scared her. That night, I noticed strange scratches on the cabin door. They weren't deep, just shallow grooves that looked like they had been made by something sharp. My dad dismissed it as an animal, but Sarah refused to leave my side for the rest of the night, growling softly at every little sound. The next day, Mike suggested we go hunting. He had brought a couple of rifles, and my dad agreed it would be a good way to spend the day. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along, mostly because I didn't want to be left alone at the cabin. We split into two groups. My dad and Mike went one way while Alex and I went another. Sarah stayed close to me, her nose to the ground and her ears twitching at every sound. We didn't see much, just a few squirrels and birds. About an hour into the hunt, Sarah froze, her body stiff as she stared into a thicket ahead. I followed her gaze but couldn't see anything. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. Alex and I stood still, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The growl came again, closer this time, and Sarah started barking furiously. I gripped the rifle tightly, my heart pounding. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the bushes, and something large bolted through the undergrowth. I caught a glimpse of dark fur and sharp claws before it disappeared into the trees. It was too fast to be a bear, and too large to be anything else I could think of. We didn't wait around to find out what it was. We ran back to the cabin, Sarah leading the way. By the time we got there, my dad and Mike were already back, their faces pale. They had heard the growls too and had seen the same thing we did. A shadowy figure moving unnaturally fast through the woods. That night, none of us slept. We barricaded the doors and windows as best as we could and kept the rifles close. Sarah lay at my feet, her ears perked and her body trembling. Around midnight, the scratching started again, this time louder and more deliberate. It moved around the cabin, first on the front door, then the back, then the windows. Sarah growled low in her throat, and my dad motioned for us to stay quiet. The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to get in, it was trying to scare us. By morning, the footsteps and scratching had stopped, but none of us felt safe. We packed up quickly, deciding to leave a day early. As we loaded the truck, I noticed deep claw marks on the porch railing and the ground around the cabin. On the drive back, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see something following us. Sarah sat in my lap, her body tense and her eyes fixed on the woods. We never figured out what it was that stalked us that weekend. My dad refused to talk about it, and Mike never came on another trip with us. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back. It was late fall when I got the call. The leaves had turned, and the air carried the first real bite of the coming winter. I was living in a small town in southern New Mexico at the time, near the border. Work was scarce and money was tight, so when a guy I knew from high school, let's call him Darren, mentioned a job that could pay more than a month's worth of bills, I didn't hesitate too much. The job was simple on the surface: drive a load of goods to a remote cabin up in the Rockies. Darren didn't say much about what was in the load, and I didn't ask. Asking questions in that kind of work wasn't a smart move. He gave me a date, a time, and coordinates instead of an address. "Follow the rules," he said, "and you'll be fine." That's how I found myself in a beat-up truck on a cold November evening, heading north. The back of the truck was loaded with sealed crates. They were nailed shut, and I was told under no circumstances was I to open them. I didn't even want to know what was inside. Guns, drugs, stolen goods, who knows? All I cared about was getting it there, getting paid, and getting out. I left at sundown. Darren had told me to avoid main highways and stick to back roads, which added hours to the trip. By the time I crossed into Colorado, the sun was gone, and the temperature had dropped. The roads were winding, dark, and empty, cutting through stretches of dense forest. Every so often, my headlights would catch a pair of glowing eyes, a deer or maybe a coyote, watching from the tree-line. About halfway through the trip, I started to feel the weight of the isolation. No streetlights, no cars, not even a distant house. Just endless trees and the hum of the truck's engine. The road signs became less frequent, and I had to rely on the GPS coordinates Darren had given me. Then the GPS cut out. No service. I had expected it. Darren had warned me, but it still unsettled me. I pulled over and checked the printed map he'd given me as a backup. It showed a series of dirt roads leading to the cabin, but the scale was off and the markings were faint. I turned off the paved road onto the first dirt path. The truck's tires crunched over gravel and mud, the forest closing in around me. Branches scraped against the sides like skeletal fingers. The further I went, the rougher the road got, until it was barely more than a trail. Deep ruts threatened to trap the truck, and I had to keep a tight grip on the wheel to avoid getting stuck. Around midnight, I came to a fork in the path. Darren's map didn't show it, and there were no signs to guide me. I stopped, trying to make sense of the faded lines on the paper, when I noticed something strange. The air smelled off. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger, a mix of metal and rot. I got out to stretch my legs and figure out which way to go. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. As I stood there, scanning the map under the truck's dome light, I heard it, a distant, low growl. I froze. It didn't sound like a coyote or any animal I recognized. It was guttural, almost like a warning. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight but saw nothing. I decided to take the left fork, figuring it was better to keep moving than to stand around and risk whatever was out there. It took another hour of slow, nerve-wracking driving before I saw it. A small wooden cabin nestled in a clearing. The place was old, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. There were no lights, no sign of life, but this matched the coordinates Darren had given me. I parked the truck and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. The cabin door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I unloaded the crates one by one, stacking them on the porch. They were heavy, and I tried not to think about what might be inside. When I was done, I went back to the truck to grab the envelope Darren had given me. It had a few final instructions and the phone number to call when the job was done. As I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. The crates I had just unloaded weren't where I'd left them. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw the drag marks in the dirt. Something or someone had moved them. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large, far too large to be human, and they circled the truck and the cabin. Whatever had made them had claws, leaving deep gouges in the frozen ground. I didn't stick around to investigate. I got back in the truck, locked the doors, and tried to start the engine. Nothing. The truck, which had been running fine all night, wouldn't even turn over. I grabbed my flashlight and the small pistol I kept in the glove box and headed back to the cabin. If I was stuck here, I needed shelter, and I needed to figure out what was going on. The inside of the cabin was as decrepit as the outside. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. A stack of canned food sat on the kitchen counter, and the fireplace was filled with fresh ashes. I barricaded the door with a heavy table and sat by the fireplace, trying to stay warm. Every so often, I'd hear noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But when I shone my flashlight through the windows, there was nothing there. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, exhaustion took over and I dozed off. I woke to a loud thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls. My flashlight revealed deep claw marks gouged into the wood outside the windows. The thing, whatever it was circling the cabin. Then came the growl, low and menacing, right outside the door. I gripped the pistol, heart racing, as the door rattled violently. The table I'd used as a barricade groaned under the pressure but held firm. The growling turned to a deafening roar, and then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun was just beginning to rise when I finally dared to look outside. The ground around the cabin was a mess of footprints and drag marks. The crates were gone, as was the truck. In their place was a single piece of paper, weighted down with a rock. It read, "Job complete. Payment sent." I walked back down the trail, following it until I reached a main road. A passing trucker gave me a ride to the nearest town. When I checked my bank account, the money was there, just as promised. I never heard from Darren again. I don't know what I delivered that night or what was out there in the woods, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that growl. I didn't want to go to the farm cabin. It was 1956 and I was 28, working as a mechanic in a small town in Tennessee. I wasn't the adventurous type, but my uncle had passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind a rundown property in a remote area of northern Kentucky. My mother insisted I go out there to look it over. She said it was my responsibility now since I was the only one in the family who could handle such things. I didn't argue. I just packed a bag and made the drive. The cabin was off a dirt road, miles from the nearest town. By the time I reached it, the sun was setting, and I immediately regretted not coming earlier. The place looked abandoned. The wooden structure leaned slightly to one side, and the roof was covered in patches of moss. A single window on the front of the cabin was cracked, and the porch steps creaked under my weight. The surrounding area was dense with trees, their branches heavy and casting long shadows. I unlocked the door with a key my mother had given me. The inside smelled like mildew and would rot. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the room. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a living space in the center, and a narrow hallway leading to what I assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the floorboards groaned with every step I took. I set my bag down on the couch and walked through the cabin, trying to get a feel for the place. In the kitchen, I found old dishes still sitting in the sink. A layer of grime covered everything. The cabinets were filled with rusted cans of food and jars of who knows what. Down the hallway, I found two bedrooms. One had a small twin bed with a moth-eaten quilt, and the other was empty except for a broken chair. The last door in the hallway led to a small bathroom. The mirror was cracked, and the toilet had a dark ring around the inside. I tried the faucet, but nothing came out. There was a hand pump outside for water, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I decided to stay the night. I didn't have much choice. The drive back to town was too far, and it was already dark. I unpacked my things and laid out a sleeping bag on the couch. The air inside the cabin was cold, so I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. The flames cast flickering shadows across the room, making it feel even more isolated. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence outside was unsettling. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft thumping sound. I sat up, listening carefully. Came again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and cautiously made my way toward the noise. The kitchen was empty. I checked the cabinets and even looked under the sink, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to head back to the couch, I heard it again, this time coming from outside. It was a steady, rhythmic thumping, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I opened the front door and shined my flashlight around the porch. The beam of light caught movement near the edge of the tree line. My heart raced as I focused on the spot, but whatever it was disappeared into the shadows. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. I went back inside and locked the door. I stoked the fire and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. The thumping stopped, and the cabin was silent again. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me, but then I noticed something strange. The dust on the floor near the front door had been disturbed. There were faint marks, almost like footprints, leading toward the kitchen. My stomach tightened as I followed the marks. They stopped at the back door, which I realized wasn't locked. I bolted the door and checked the windows to make sure they were secure. The uneasiness was turning into full-blown fear. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight, and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and decided to leave. I didn't care about inspecting the property anymore. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt near the porch, there were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were too big and too deep, like someone heavy had been walking around the cabin. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I told my mother I didn't want anything to do with the cabin. She didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I'd always heard about the beauty of the Adirondacks during the fall. People said the mountains looked like they were on fire, with reds, oranges, and yellows blanketing the slopes. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, especially after a few rough months at work. So when my friend Mark offered me the keys to his family's cabin, I jumped at the chance. It was early October 2018 when I drove up. I was 31 at the time, single, and living in New Jersey. The cabin was about a 6-hour drive away, tucked deep in the woods near Lake George. Mark said it was peaceful, isolated, and perfect for someone who wanted to escape the noise of the city. That sounded exactly like what I needed. The drive itself was beautiful. As I left the city behind, the scenery transformed. Towering trees lined the roads, their leaves fluttering down like confetti. The air felt cleaner, cooler. By the time I reached the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, I was in full vacation mode. The cabin was small but cozy, a single-story building with a porch that overlooked a clearing in the woods. Inside, there was a living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. Mark had stocked it with firewood and enough canned goods to last a week. I brought my own groceries, some books, and a notebook to jot down ideas. It was perfect until it wasn't. The first evening was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner, read by the fireplace, and enjoyed the silence. It was rare to hear nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. By 10 p.m., I was ready for bed. The bed in the cabin was a bit smaller than I was used to, but it was comfortable. As I drifted off, I noticed how pitch black it was outside. Even with the blinds open, there wasn't a single light. I told myself it was just nature, nothing to worry about. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. There wasn't a loud noise or anything like that, but something felt off. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my imagination, and went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that Mark had mentioned. It led to a small creek about a mile away. I packed some water and a granola bar, grabbed a walking stick, and headed out. The trail was overgrown but manageable. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining overhead like a tunnel. I saw animal tracks in the dirt, deer maybe, and heard the occasional rustling in the bushes. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached the creek, I sat on a rock and enjoyed the sound of the water. It was the kind of quiet I'd been craving. But after a while, I noticed something strange. Across the creek, on the opposite bank, the bushes were moving, not like an animal passing through, but like someone was crouching there. I stared for a long time, but I didn't see anything. Eventually, I chalked it up to the wind and headed back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I froze, straining to hear more. The steps were slow, deliberate. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but deep down, I knew better. The steps were too heavy. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The steps stopped as soon as I turned on the light. I stayed up for hours listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of the clearing. A single footprint. It was larger than mine, and the tread pattern didn't look like a hiking boot. It was more like a work boot, thick, heavy, and deep enough to suggest whoever made it was carrying weight. I told myself it was probably an old print, left by someone who'd passed through weeks ago, but it didn't sit right with me. I spent most of the day inside trying to write, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise outside caught my attention. The creak of a tree, the snap of a twig. It all felt too close. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, as they passed by the windows. Once again, as soon as I turned on the flashlight, they stopped. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave. I packed up my things, but the thought of driving down that narrow dirt road in the dark didn't sit well with me. I decided to stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. As the sun set, I made sure every door and window was locked. I even dragged a chair in front of the door for extra security. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud thud. Came from the porch. I grabbed the flashlight and my pocket knife. My heart was pounding as I crept to the window. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the porch, but it was empty. Then I saw the footprints. They were on the porch, leading from the steps to the front door. I backed away, my hands shaking. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I grabbed my keys and bag, threw on a jacket, and made a dash for my car. The driveway was only about 50 feet away, but it felt like miles. The entire time, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, or worse. When I reached the car, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move. I didn't wait to find out. I backed out of the driveway and sped down the dirt road. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I made it home just as the sun was rising. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise in my apartment made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just some local hunter or a camper who'd wandered too close. But the truth is, I'll never know. I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since. Sometimes, I think about that cabin and wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed another night. Whatever was out there, I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out.